I want to start by saying something that most people get wrong when they tell this story. They say humanity was caught off guard. They say we scrambled, panicked, threw together a response at the last minute and got lucky. That is not what happened. What happened was something else entirely. Something that the Vorath Collective, with all their centuries of diplomatic manipulation, with all their careful study of lesser species, with all their elegant and perfectly timed ultimatums, never once considered possible. They thought they understood us. They had watched us for 61 years, catalogued our wars, our treaties, our surrenders. They had attended every United Earth summit from a distance, reading our speeches, measuring our posturing, calculating the exact threshold at which a human government would fold. They had a model, a perfect, comprehensive model of human behavior under existential pressure. And they were not wrong about most of it. They were wrong about one thing. They did not account for what humans do when they have already decided the answer before the question is even asked. My name is Ezra Maddox. I was 44 years old when the Vorath delivered their ultimatum. I was a senior fleet liaison attached to the 9th Expeditionary Command, based out of Titan Station, and I had spent the better part of 11 years ferrying orders between admirals who hated each other and politicians who hated the admirals. I was not a war hero. I was not a strategist. I was a man who was very good at sitting in rooms where important people were saying important things and making sure the right words got to the right people at the right time. That is why I was in the room when it happened. And that is why I am the one telling you this story. The ultimatum. The Vorath message arrived on a Tuesday. I know that sounds mundane. It sounds like the beginning of a boring memo, a Tuesday. But I remember it being a Tuesday because I had a dentist appointment that morning. An actual, physical, old-fashioned dentist appointment at the clinic on Titan Station's Level 4. And I had been looking forward to it because after the dentist, I was going to take the rest of the afternoon off and watch a football match from Earth on delayed broadcast. I never made it to the dentist. The message came through on the Galactic Relay Network at 6:12 station time. It was not addressed to any one government. It was not addressed to the United Earth Council or the Pacific Alliance or the Colonial Assembly. It was broadcast on every frequency humanity used for interstellar communication, simultaneously, in 47 languages, including 3 that most humans didn't know anyone had bothered to translate. The Vorath had bothered. They had bothered to translate their ultimatum into Esperanto. That, more than anything, should have told them something about how seriously they had studied us, and it should have told us something about how long they had been planning this. The message was precise. The Vorath did not do dramatic. They did not do theatrics. They were a species that had been conducting galactic diplomacy for 400 years, and in that time they had learned that clarity was a weapon more effective than ambiguity. So the message was clear. Humanity would surrender administrative control of 12 systems, the outer colonial systems, the ones furthest from Earth, the ones with the richest deposits of element 7 compound ore within 90 days. In exchange, the Vorath would guarantee the safety of Earth and the inner colonies. The word guarantee was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. If humanity did not comply, the Vorath Collective, a coalition of 11 species spanning 37 star systems, would begin a process of enforced compliance. Those were their words, enforced compliance, which was a very polished way of saying they would start destroying things until we said yes. They gave us 90 days to negotiate. The first response. The United Earth Council met in emergency session within 4 hours of the message. I was not in that session. I was standing outside it, in a corridor on Titan Station's administrative level, watching a young ensign named Parvathi try to look calm while her hands were shaking. She was 22, fresh out of the Fleet Academy. She had been assigned to courier duty because someone had decided that the emergency session required physical document delivery, actual printed documents, which is what happens when you don't trust encrypted channels during a first contact crisis. She was carrying a satchel full of strategic assessment reports. She was trying not to drop it. "You okay?" I asked her. She looked at me. She had these dark eyes, very serious, and she said, "Sir, are we going to fight them?" And I said, "I don't know," which was true at the time. What I did know was that the council session was going badly. I could tell from the voices. Walls on Titan Station are thick, but not that thick, and when admirals and senators start raising their voices, the particular frequency of institutional panic carries through polymer composite like it carries through water. The session lasted 9 hours. When Admiral Yuan Chen came out, she walked right past me without looking at me. That was how I knew something significant had been decided. Yuan Chen was the kind of person who acknowledged every person in every room she entered. It was a habit she had developed over 30 years of command, a way of making people feel seen and therefore loyal. When she walked past me without looking, it meant her mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere very far away. 20 minutes later, her aide found me and told me to report to the 9th Expeditionary Command Center. Immediately. The command center. The 9th Expeditionary Command Center on Titan Station was not impressive to look at. That was intentional. The architects had designed it to look like a standard administrative hub, medium-sized room, standard displays, the kind of place where people processed shipping manifests and colony supply requests. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you would have walked through it without a second glance. What you couldn't see from the outside was that it sat above 40 meters of reinforced structure, was shielded against every form of electronic interference currently cataloged, and was connected via dedicated hardline to every fleet command node between Mars and the outer belt. When I walked in, there were 14 people already there. I recognized most of them: Admiral Chen, Vice Admiral Okafor, 3 fleet commodores whose names I will not include here because 2 of them are still technically active in advisory roles, and one of them has specifically asked me not to. There were 2 figures from the Interstellar Intelligence Division. I only know that because of the specific absence of any insignia on their uniforms, which is IID standard practice. And there was a civilian, a small woman with gray hair and a posture so straight it looked engineered, wearing a plain dark jacket, who I did not recognize at the time but later learned was Dr. Mara Solis, the head of the Strategic Futures Division. She was the one who spoke first. "The Council," she said, without preamble, without looking up from whatever she was reading on her tablet, "has authorized a response." She said it the way you say something that is the conclusion of a very long internal argument, like the words cost something. "What kind of response?" I asked, because apparently I was the only one in the room willing to ask the obvious question. She looked up at me then. She had gray eyes, very pale, and the expression on her face was something I had trouble categorizing. It was not satisfaction. It was not fear. It was something closer to the look a chess player gets when they have made a move that cannot be unmade. "The kind," she said, "that they are not expecting." What they expected. Here is what the Vorath expected. They expected humanity to send a diplomatic delegation. This was standard procedure in galactic affairs. When a lesser species received an ultimatum from a collective, they sent representatives, diplomats. People trained to negotiate the terms of submission in a way that preserved some degree of dignity and autonomy. The Vorath had studied 61 years of human diplomatic history. They knew we had done this before, with lesser conflicts. They knew we had a sophisticated diplomatic corps. They knew we had people who were very good at sitting across tables from hostile parties and finding middle ground. They had a specific expectation about who we would send. The Vorath's internal intelligence, which, as it turns out, we had partially compromised through a long-running operation I was not cleared to know about, indicated that they anticipated a delegation of 5 to 12 senior diplomats, accompanied by military advisors in an advisory capacity, and that the negotiation process would take between 40 and 60 of the 90 days before a preliminary agreement was reached. They had prepared a reception chamber. They had assigned a senior Vorath arbiter, a diplomat named Velkorath, who had successfully negotiated 17 compliance agreements with 14 different species over his career, to lead the response team. They had, in short, prepared for a conversation. What we sent, 22 days after the ultimatum was delivered. 22 days, not 90, 22. At 300 hours, Titan Station time on the 22nd day, Admiral Yuan Chen walked into the command center where I was working a night shift, set a data chip on my console and said, "Send that on the priority relay. Authorization code 7 Sigma Actual." I looked at the code. 7 Sigma Actual was not an authorization level I had ever used. I had heard of it. Everyone in the fleet had heard of it. It was the code reserved for orders that came directly from the United Earth Council's Defense Oversight Committee, bypassing normal chain-of-command structure for matters of immediate strategic implementation. It had been used 4 times in the history of the United Earth Navy. I scented. What happened next is not something I witnessed directly. I have assembled this account from debriefs, from records that were later partially declassified, from conversations with people who were in positions I was not. But I am going to tell it to you the way it happened, because it deserves to be told properly. The fleet. They did not come from one place. That was the first thing that the Vorath's long-range sensor networks failed to process correctly. Their intelligence model assumed that if humanity were to mount any kind of military response, which they considered unlikely, it would involve a single fleet, assembled from Earth's primary naval yards, traveling on a direct approach vector to the designated meeting point in the Cathara neutral zone. This is how every other species in the collective had done it. You assemble your force from your primary military installation. You travel to the meeting point. You either negotiate from a position of strength, or you demonstrate that strength is not sufficient and you negotiate from a position of weakness. Clean, predictable, manageable. The Vorath were not prepared for what the long-range sensors of the Cathara monitoring station actually picked up. The signals came from 17 different vectors. 17. Not one fleet, not one assembly point. 17 independent approach signatures, spread across an arc of nearly 90 degrees of stellar approach, converging on the Cathara neutral zone from directions that made no navigational sense. Because you don't approach a neutral zone from the direction of the outer colonies, or from the sparse systems beyond the heliopause, unless your fleet was already there before the meeting was called. The Vorath monitoring officer who first logged the incoming signatures, a Drethani named Sovalius, whose account was later recovered and translated, reportedly spent 6 minutes staring at his display before he filed a report. He thought his instruments were malfunctioning. They were not. What Sovalius saw. I have read Sovalius's report. The translated version, obviously, my Drethani is non-existent. But the translation is thorough, and whoever did it preserved something of the original tone, which is remarkable because the original tone is barely controlled panic dressed up in the formal register of an official monitoring report. He begins with standard nomenclature. Incoming signatures detected at bearing such and such. Velocity within expected approach parameters for transition from FTL, numbers pending confirmation. Then the numbers started coming in. The first fleet, and I use the word fleet loosely, because it was more of a vanguard, dropped out of FTL at the outer edge of the Cathara zone at 8:47 hours, Vorath Standard Time. It consisted of 31 vessels. Sovalius categorized them initially as medium-class warships, which was approximately correct, though medium class is somewhat misleading because what humanity categorizes as a medium warship, most species in the collective categorize as something closer to a heavy assault platform. He filed that report. He was beginning to formulate the message to his superiors when the second signature resolved. 47 ships. He was still processing that when the third signature resolved. I am going to list the numbers the way Sovalius listed them in his report, because the progression is important. First signature, 31 vessels. Second, 47. Third, 62. Fourth, 39. Fifth, 88. He stopped his report at the fifth signature. In the original Drethani, there is an idiom. I'm told it translates approximately as the ground has become water. It's an expression of foundational disorientation, of discovering that the thing you were standing on is not what you thought it was. Sovalius used that idiom in his report. Then he kept going. Sixth signature, 54 vessels. Seventh, 112. Eighth, 73. Ninth, 41. 10th, 96. At this point, his report notes that he contacted his superior officer, a senior monitoring coordinator named Velthon, to request a second set of eyes on his instruments. Velthon arrived, looked at the display. said nothing for what so Valius records as several breath cycles. Then Velthon said, in what I imagine was a very quiet voice, "Keep counting." 11th signature, 67. 12th, 81. 13th, 44. 14th, 133. 15th, 58. 16th, 92. 17th, 211. Total vessel count, as recorded by Valius before he filed his emergency upward report: 1,379 warships. Assembled from 17 different vectors. All arriving within a 12-minute window. All converging on the Cathara neutral zone. Not to negotiate. The silence. The Vorath response to this was silence. Not dramatic silence, not the silence of an enemy preparing a countermove. The silence of a system that does not have a prepared response for the thing that is happening to it. The Vorath Collective had a very sophisticated response tree for diplomatic encounters with emerging species. It had been refined over 4 centuries and 23 first contact scenarios. It was comprehensive. It covered rebellion, defiance, counteroffers, alliance requests, even the occasional military demonstration. A species showing up with a dozen warships to make a point was not unheard of. 1,379 warships was not in the tree. Back on Titan Station, I was at my console watching the relay signals bounce in real time, watching the fleet positioning data resolve on the tactical display, and the room was very quiet. Not because people were scared, because people were watching something that had been planned for a very long time and planned very carefully, execute exactly as intended, and there is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a room when that happens. Admiral Chen was standing 3 meters away from me, her hands behind her back, watching the tactical display. She had not moved in 40 minutes. The names. Let me tell you about some of the ships. The UEN Adamant was a heavy assault carrier, 3 kilometers long, designed for sustained deep space operations in contested territory. She had been commissioned 8 years before the Vorath ultimatum and had spent most of her service life patrolling the outer colonial systems, the exact systems the Vorath wanted us to hand over. She was the flagship of the 17th Fleet Element, the 211 ship signature that arrived last. The UEN Relentless was older, 20 years in service, a battle cruiser with a combat record that stretched back to the Kepler incident, which was a conflict most people outside the military have never heard of, and which I will not detail here except to say that the Relentless survived 3 events during that conflict that her designers had not considered survivable. She had been rebuilt twice. She was still flying. The UEN Constancy was brand new. She had been completed at the Ganymede shipyards 4 months before the ultimatum. She had never fired her weapons in anger. She was the largest ship in the fleet, 4 kilometers from bow to stern, heavy armor, 16 primary weapons arrays, capable of sustained engagement against a superior force for 72 hours without resupply. I mention these 3 specifically because they were the first ships to reach optimal position, and because what happened next involved them directly. The message. When all 17 fleet elements were in position, a formation that, when you looked at it on a tactical display, formed a rough sphere around the Cathara neutral zone, covering every possible approach and exit vector, Admiral Chen walked to the communications console. She composed a message. I was watching her. She did not consult notes. She did not dictate to an aide. She typed it herself, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been composing those words in their head for 22 days. Then she transmitted it. The message went to the Vorath arbiter Velkorath, who was sitting in his prepared reception chamber, waiting for the human diplomatic delegation. I have the message, verbatim, because it was logged in the official record and later included in the declassified brief. It was 41 words. You prepared a room for our diplomats. We prepared something else. What you see on your sensors is not a fleet. It is our answer. The question was whether we negotiate. The answer is no. Tell us, do you have more questions? 41 words. Admiral Yuan Chen, former commander of the Pacific Fleet, 3-time decorated officer of the United Earth Navy, grandmother of 4. She wrote 41 words that ended a war before it started. Velkorath, The Vorath arbiter Velkorath was, by all available accounts, a formidably intelligent being. He had spent his career mastering the art of the long game, understanding that negotiations were never really about the current moment, but about positioning for future moments. He was patient. He was methodical. He was, in the specific vocabulary of Vorath diplomatic culture, unshakable. He was shaken. His response came back 4 hours after Chen's message. 4 hours, which in Vorath diplomatic terms is nearly instantaneous. Their standard minimum response time for a formal communication was 24 hours, to allow for appropriate deliberation and the appearance of careful consideration. He did not take 24 hours. He took 4. His response was formally worded, in the way that Vorath communications always were. But even through the translation layer, you could hear something underneath the formality, something that had not been there in the original ultimatum, a quality that I can only describe as recalibration. He acknowledged that the situation had developed in an unanticipated manner. He requested clarification on whether the assembled fleet represented humanity's full military capacity or a selected element thereof. He suggested that further dialogue might be beneficial to both parties. He used the phrase, both parties. In the original ultimatum, the Vorath had not used that phrase. They had used the collective and the human nation-states. Not parties, not equals in a dialogue, the collective and the humans. The change in language was not accidental. Admiral Chen's response to his clarification request was a single line. Assume it is a selected element. The 48 hours. What followed was not a negotiation. I want to be precise about this, because there are accounts of this event that frame what happened next as a successful negotiation, as humanity demonstrating willingness to talk and the Vorath backing down. That is not accurate. What happened was a process of gradual realization on the Vorath side, conducted over 48 hours, during which the full implications of what they were looking at slowly became clear. The fleet did not move. It held position at the edge of the Cathara neutral zone, silent, configured in its spherical formation, 17 fleet elements precisely placed. Every few hours, the Vorath monitoring stations would take new readings, and the numbers would come back exactly the same. 1,379 ships. No degradation in formation. No signs of supply strain. No communications suggesting internal disagreement or fatigue. Just presence. Just the fact of the thing, sitting there patient and absolute. I was told later, by one of the IID figures who had been in the command center that first night, that there were additional elements of the fleet that were not visible to Vorath sensors, that the 17 signatures Sovalius had logged were what humanity was allowing the Vorath to see, that the full picture was larger. I don't know if that is true. I was not cleared for that information. But I believe it. The numbers no one talks about. Here is something that rarely appears in the public accounts of what became known as the Cathara Stand. The Vorath Collective, in their internal assessment, had estimated human military capacity at somewhere between 200 and 400 warship equivalents. This estimate was based on 61 years of observation, analysis of publicly available information about Earth's military budget, and models derived from the typical military development curve of species at humanity's stage of technological advancement. They were not unintelligent beings. They were not working from bad data. They were simply operating from a fundamental misunderstanding of what humanity had been doing during those 61 years. The Vorath saw our wars. They cataloged our conflicts, our arms races, our military spending. They understood that we were a violent species with a long history of organized warfare. What they did not understand, what they had no framework to understand, was the specific way that a species with humanity's particular history responds to an existential threat that it can see coming. We had seen them coming. Not specifically the Vorath. We had not known it would be the Vorath exactly with their 400-year diplomatic empire and their 11-species collective and their perfectly worded ultimatums. But we had known, or suspected, or feared with the specific productive fear that generates action rather than paralysis, that something like them was out there. And we had been building. Not loudly, not in ways that would show up clearly on long-range observation. not in ways that fit the Vorath's model of how a nation-state announces its military ambitions. We had been building the way humans build when they think no one is watching, and the thing they're building is the thing they think they might actually need someday. Quietly, consistently, for 30 years. The fleet that assembled in the Cathara neutral zone was not assembled in 22 days. 22 days was the time it took to move the pieces into position. The pieces had been there for years, waiting, dispersed across the outer systems, operating under the cover of colonial patrol assignments and deep space survey designations, and half a dozen other classifications that looked, from the outside, like exactly what they were claimed to be. The Vorath had seen the pieces, they had not seen the pattern. Day 3. On the third day, the Vorath requested a direct communication. Not a message relay, not a formal diplomatic channel. A direct, real-time communication between Arbiter Velkorath and the commanding officer of the human fleet. Admiral Chen agreed. I was in the room for this. I was running the communication protocols, making sure the translation was clean, monitoring for any attempts to embed secondary signals in the carrier frequency, keeping the official log. I had a headset and a console, and I was sitting at the far end of the room, which meant I was close enough to hear everything but far enough away that I could tell myself I was technical staff rather than a witness to history. The translation software rendered Velkorath's voice in a dry, measured baritone. The actual quality of his voice I cannot describe because I don't have the physiological vocabulary. The Vorath don't have vocal cords in any sense I understand, and the sounds they produce cover a range that human ears catch only partially. He opened with standard Vorath diplomatic protocol, acknowledgement of both parties, formal statement of the purpose of communication, the kind of preamble that in human diplomatic contexts would make everyone restless. Admiral Chen waded through all of it. Then Velkorath said, in translation, "We would like to understand the nature of what you have assembled." Chen said no. A pause, long enough that I checked the connection. Then Velkorath said, "You decline to explain." Chen said, "I decline to explain things that don't require explanation. You can see what we've assembled. You don't need me to describe it." Another pause. The collective, Velkorath said, had not anticipated this response. "I know," Chen said. "We had prepared for negotiation." "I know. We had prepared arguments, frameworks for mutual benefit, a structure by which both," he paused slightly, "both parties could arrive at an outcome that preserved dignity while achieving necessary strategic objectives." "Yes," Chen said, "we know what you prepared." Something in the quality of that silence changed. The Vorath are, apparently, difficult to read emotionally across species lines, but there are people who have spent their careers studying the subtle tells in their communication patterns, and one of the IID figures in the room made a small note on her tablet at that moment. I saw it from across the room. I couldn't read what it said. "You knew," Velkorath said slowly in translation. "Before the ultimatum, you knew this was coming." Chen looked at the communication display. Her expression did not change. "We hoped it wasn't," she said, "but we prepared as if it was." The silence that followed that statement lasted nearly 2 minutes. In that silence, I felt something I can only describe as a shift, the way a room feels different after a window is opened. Not better or worse necessarily, just different, like the air has changed. When Velkorath spoke again, his tone was different. I noticed it. Everyone in the room noticed it. "What are your terms?" he said. And that was when Admiral Chen allowed herself one small, controlled smile. The terms were simple. The 12 systems stay. Every human colony, every mining operation, every installation in every system that the Vorath had identified as a negotiating target remains under United Earth authority. Full stop. The Vorath Collective acknowledges humanity's status as a sovereign interstellar civilization with full territorial rights over all currently occupied systems, and a defined sphere of development extending to an agreed boundary. The Collective agrees to a non-interference protocol covering all human-claimed space. And in exchange, humanity agrees to open direct diplomatic relations with the Collective, not as a subordinate species, not as a client state, as a peer, An equal party in whatever passes for galactic governance in this arm of the galaxy. That last part was Chen's addition. She told me later it was the part she had fought hardest for in the council session. Not the military terms, those were the obvious ones, the ones everyone understood. The diplomatic terms, the insistence on being treated as equals, not just tolerated as a military inconvenience. You can have a strong fleet and still be talked down to, she said. I wanted them to understand that the fleet wasn't the point. The fleet was just the argument. The point was what the argument was making the case for. The Voreth took 11 hours to respond to the terms. When they responded, they accepted. All of them. What Velkoreth said after. This is not in the official record. I was told this by someone who was in the room on the Vorath side, a junior monitoring officer named Teth Salan, who later became one of the first Vorath exchange diplomats assigned to Earth, and who told me this story over a meal in a restaurant in Cape Town, 11 years after Cathara. When the acceptance was finalized and the communication was closed, Velkoreth sat in the reception chamber, the chamber he had prepared for the human diplomatic delegation, for a long time. Just sitting. His delegation staff didn't interrupt him. Eventually, one of his junior staff asked him if he was all right. And Velkoreth said, and Teth Salan remembered this specifically, because it was the most uncharacteristic thing he had ever heard Velkoreth say, he said, I made a mistake, a fundamental one. I read their history and I saw a species that goes to war easily. I did not see a species that prepares for war carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, there is a difference, and it is the difference that matters. That is the first part of this story. But it is not the whole story. Because what happened in the Cathara neutral zone was the moment that changed the equation. But the story of why it was possible, the story of the fleet itself, of the people who built it and flew it and held it in position for 72 hours while the Vorath recalibrated their entire model of human civilization. That story happened in the ships. And the ship I know best is the UEN Adamant. Because I was on it for what came next. End of Part 1. Part 2. Document format, witness narrative, first-person account. Continuation. Archive reference HFY 7741 Sigma narrator. Senior Fleet Liaison Ezra Maddox, United Earth Navy, retired. 3 weeks after the Cathara stand, I was reassigned. I didn't ask for the reassignment. I didn't know it was coming. I was still on Titan Station, still running communication protocols, still processing the backwash of documentation that a major diplomatic event generates. After-action reports, asset verification logs, signal intelligence summaries, the kind of work that needs to be done but nobody particularly wants to do. Then Admiral Chen called me into her office and told me I was being transferred to the UEN Adamant. Why, I asked, which was probably not the most tactful opening. She looked at me with that expression she had, the one that was patient without being warm, the one that communicated very clearly that she was answering your question as a courtesy, not as an obligation. Because Admiral Cassara wants a fleet liaison who is present for the political side, she said. And because you're good at being in rooms. She meant it as a compliment, I'm fairly sure. The UEN Adamant was docked at the Titan orbital ring, 3 kilometers of gray hull and sensor arrays and weapons platforms, looking like something that had been designed by someone who took the phrase, overwhelming force, as a personal challenge. I was ferried up in a shuttle that felt approximately the size of a pea relative to the ship, and the first thing I saw when I cleared the main landing bay was the scale of the thing. I had seen ships like this on displays. I had processed their specifications. I had even visited a couple of carriers before, briefly, in my role as a liaison. I had not been aboard one that had just spent 72 hours sitting at the edge of a neutral zone, facing down a galactic collective, while humanity's future hung in whatever passed for the balance. The crew knew what they had done. You could feel it in the air, not arrogance, not exactly. More like the specific, quiet confidence of people who had been asked to do something nearly impossible and had simply done it. Admiral Sioyun Cassara. Admiral Cassara was 61 years old and looked 50. She was Korean-American, born in Busan, raised in Vancouver, commissioned from the Fleet Academy in her early 20s and never looked back. She had commanded the 17th Fleet Element, The 211 ship signature, the largest single component of the Cathara assembly for 6 years. She met me in her command briefing room, which was not a large room despite being on a very large ship. The Adamant's command spaces were functional, not spacious. Every square meter had a purpose. She looked me over the way senior officers look at new additions to their teams, evaluating without quite staring, forming impressions she would later revise or confirm. "You were in the room when we sent the first message," she said. "Yes, Admiral." "And when we received the Vorath's response?" "Yes." She nodded, not as if this information was useful exactly, more as if it confirmed something she had already suspected. "I want someone who understands that this is not over," she said. "Cathara was the first move. The Vorath backed down quickly, too quickly, by some assessments. There are people in the collective who think Vel'Korath capitulated inappropriately, people who want to test whether Cathara was a bluff." "Was it?" I asked. She looked at me for a moment. "No," she said, "it was not. The Adamant—" "Let me tell you about the ship, because the ship is important." The UEN Adamant was commissioned 8 years before Cathara. She had been built at the Callisto Orbital Yards under a program that was officially classified as a long-range exploration and survey vessel. The classification was not technically inaccurate. She was capable of long-range independent operation, and she carried survey equipment alongside her weapons systems. She was also 3 kilometers long, armed with 16 primary plasma rail arrays, 412 point defense batteries, a complement of 860 strike fighters across 12 launch bays, and a crew of 11,200 people. The survey equipment was accurate, it just wasn't the interesting part. She had been operating in the outer colonial systems for 4 years before Cathara, rotating through a schedule of patrol assignments that kept her consistently in the outer belt. Officially because the colonial patrol route called for a heavy support presence. Unofficially because the Adamant needed to be in a position where she could assemble with the rest of the fleet on 22 days' notice. Her crew had known this, not officially, not in any briefing, but 11,000 people spend enough time talking to each other and enough time doing things that make no logistical sense for a survey vessel that after a while the understanding is simply present without ever having been stated. They had been waiting, and when the order came, they were ready. The crew. I want to tell you about some of the people on the Adamant, not the officers. The officers' records are available in the public archive. I want to tell you about the people below the command tier, because they are the ones who are never in the official history, and they are the ones who made the thing work. There was a weapons technician on the Adamant named Marco Vasquez. He was 36, originally from Guadalajara, had joined the fleet when he was 22 because the mining industry on Luna that his family had been part of for 3 generations was being replaced by automated systems, and the fleet was hiring. He had spent 14 years learning the specific and arcane craft of maintaining plasma rail arrays, which requires a combination of engineering knowledge, mechanical aptitude, and what I can only describe as intuition. The ability to know when a system is going to develop a problem before the sensors flag it. He was very good at his job. When the Cathara order came through, Marco Vasquez spent 36 of the 72 hours that the fleet held position in the neutral zone awake. Not because anyone ordered him to. Because 3 of the Adamant's 16 primary arrays had been running at a suboptimal power balance, and while the arrays were fully operational, Marco had decided that if this was the moment when what they had spent years preparing for was finally happening, he was not going to be the reason that anything was less than perfect. He fixed the balance, took him most of those 36 hours, did it without filing a maintenance request that would have shown up on the Admiral's status board and potentially flagged a concern. When I talked to him months later, I asked him why he didn't just file the request. He looked at me like the question didn't quite make sense. "Because it was fine," he said. "Operational parameters were met. I just wanted it better than fine." There was a navigation specialist named Priya Okonkwo. She was 28, Nigerian-British, had graduated 2nd in her class from the Fleet Academy navigation program. She had been on the Adamant for 2 years. She was responsible for maintaining the Adamant's position during the Cathara hold. the 72 hours that the fleet sat in formation. Holding position in deep space sounds simple. It is not simple. There are gravitational currents, the output pressure of nearby stars, the accumulated drift from thousands of minor corrections. Keeping 211 ships in a precise formation, at exact specified coordinates, for 72 hours, while 17 fleet elements from different originating vectors maintain their own positions around you, that is not simple. Priya Okonkwo kept the Adamant at exactly the position it was supposed to be. Her drift tolerance across the entire 72-hour hold was 11 meters. In a formation covering hundreds of thousands of kilometers, 11 meters is nothing. It is noise. It is less than the precision of the instruments measuring it. She was, from what I could observe, completely calm throughout. When I asked her what it was like holding position in a neutral zone while the fate of human-Vorath relations resolved itself, she thought about it for a moment and then said, "Quiet. It was mostly very quiet. And then not quiet for a while when we got the confirmation that the Vorath had accepted. And then quiet again." She paused. "I cried," she said. "When we got the confirmation, not a lot, just a little. It was—" She stopped, looking for the word. "Relief," she said finally. "Just relief." The fighters. The Adamant carried 860 strike fighters across 12 launch bays. During the Cathara hold, not a single one of them launched. This sounds like it means they were irrelevant. It does not mean that. The 860 fighters sitting in their bays, fueled and armed and with pilots suited and strapped in, through every hour of those 72 hours, that was its own kind of communication. The Vorath's sensors could detect the energy signatures of powered fighter complements. They knew the Adamant's fighters were ready. They were not launched because they did not need to be. They were not launched because the fleet's presence was the message. And that message was already so clear that the exclamation point of 860 launched fighters was not necessary. But they were ready. The pilots were ready. I talked to one of them, a flight leader named Dmitry Volkov, 29 years old, from a city in Russia that I'm not going to name because he asked me not to. He had 3,200 hours in a strike fighter. He had been in the suit for all 72 hours of the hold. Weren't you tired?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Did you want to launch?" He thought about this longer than I expected. "No," he said. "I wanted them to let us go home." He looked at me. "We all did," he said. "Every pilot in that bay, we wanted to go home. We also knew that if we had to, we wouldn't go until it was done." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not heroism," he said. "That's just," he searched for it. "That's just what you agreed to when you signed up. The signal. Here is something that was not widely reported. On the 44th hour of the Cathara hold, a signal was detected from the far edge of the neutral zone. A new signal, not the Vorath monitoring stations, not a relay echo. A new signal on a frequency that didn't match anything in the Vorath diplomatic communication catalog. It was analyzed in approximately 9 minutes. It was a Vorath military frequency, encrypted, but not using the standard collective diplomatic encryption, using a different protocol, one that the IID's Signal Analysis Division had partially cataloged from previous observations. It was a fleet assembly signal. Someone in the Vorath system was calling ships. The notification went up the command chain immediately. Admiral Cassara was informed within 20 minutes. She went to the command deck, looked at the signal analysis, had a short conversation with her flag intelligence officer, and then went back to her command briefing room. She sent a single message to Admiral Chen on Titan Station. I saw the message, because routing it through the relay was my job. It said signal logged, position holding, awaiting instruction. Chen's response, hold. That was it. For 8 hours, the Adamant and the 210 other ships in the 17th element and the 1,200 and some ships in the other 16 elements held. The Vorath military signal continued. There were secondary signals, a response. A brief exchange that the IID was working to decode in real time. Then the signals stopped. And 14 hours later, Velkorath's acceptance came through. I asked Admiral Cassara, much later, whether she had been concerned during those 8 hours. She was sitting at the table in her briefing room. She had a mug of tea that had been sitting there long enough to go cold. She looked at me the way she often looked at me, evaluating, considering. Concerned, she repeated like she was testing the word. Afraid maybe, I said, or worried. There is a difference, she said, between concern and doubt. I was concerned, I am always concerned. Concern is appropriate, it means you are paying attention. She picked up the mug. I was not doubtful. What's the difference? Doubt, she said, is wondering whether the thing you prepared will be enough. I did not wonder that. She put the mug down. We built enough. We'd always built enough. I knew what we had. The question was never whether we could hold, it was whether they would see it clearly enough to understand what holding meant. Did they? She almost smiled. Velkorath's a smart being, he saw it. The Vorath military signal. I am going to tell you what was in the Vorath military signal, because it was decoded eventually, and because it is relevant. The signal was from a commander in the Vorath enforcement fleet, their military arm named Vrethkon. He had been positioned with a defensive fleet at the far edge of Vorath-controlled space, tasked with responding to any direct threat to collective territory. When the human fleet assembled at Cathara, Vrethkon had filed an immediate request to bring his fleet forward, to position it as a counterforce, to demonstrate that the collective was not without military options. Velkorath's response had been one of the secondary signals. The decoded translation of Velkorath's response to Vrethkon was, in full, do not move your fleet. If you bring your fleet forward, they will see it as an escalation, and they will respond to it, and what we are trying to prevent will happen because you moved first. Hold position. Trust that I know what I am doing. And then, after a pause, because the exchange was in real-time transmission, and there was a gap between the messages, Velkorath added. And Vrethkon, I have seen what they assembled. Your fleet would not be sufficient. Do not move. Vrethkon held. The crisis ended. That exchange, those two messages, are not widely discussed in the public history of Cathara. They are in the archive, but they are not discussed because they are uncomfortable to discuss, because they require acknowledging the specific nature of the deterrence that made Cathara work. It was not that we showed up with enough ships to win a fight. It was that we showed up with enough ships that the people on the other side who wanted a fight were told, by their own diplomats, that they should not start one. After, the fleet dispersed over the following 3 weeks. Ships returned to their assigned patrol routes, their colonial coverage areas, their official designations. The Adamant went back to the outer belt, resuming her survey schedule, maintaining her official classification. The cover was maintained, would continue to be maintained for years. I was on the Adamant for 4 months, long enough to understand the ship, to understand something of the people on it, to begin to develop the kind of knowledge that comes from sustained observation rather than brief encounter. The crew of the Adamant, 11,200 people, had spent 4 years preparing for something they were never officially told was coming. They had done their jobs. They had maintained their readiness. When the moment came, they had held position for 72 hours in a neutral zone, visible to a hostile collective sensors, fully armed, fully capable, and completely controlled. Not one incident of indiscipline. Not one unauthorized communication. Not one mistake. 11,200 people, and they were perfect. Not because they were perfect people. Marco Vasquez had a gambling problem he'd been dealing with for 3 years. Priya Okonkwo had a difficult relationship with her father that she talked about sometimes in the quiet of the night shift. Dmitry Volkov had a fear of deep space that he managed rather than eliminated, a fear that he had decided was not sufficient reason to stop doing the work. They were not perfect people. They were people who had decided what the work required of them and had provided it. That is a different thing. The following year, the Vorath Collective sent their first exchange diplomatic mission to Earth 11 months after Cathara. Velkorath was not in the delegation. He had retired, apparently, or the Vorath equivalent of retirement, which as far as anyone could determine involved a very long contemplative period that was culturally prescribed for senior diplomats following major career events. The delegation was led by a younger Vorath diplomat named Sevmora, who was described by everyone who met her as sharp and direct, and almost deliberately unpreamble why, which was apparently unusual for a Vorath diplomat. She arrived at the Earth Diplomatic Center in Geneva with a small staff, conducted her meetings efficiently, and at one point, during a break in a session that I was attending in my capacity as a fleet liaison, she sat next to me in the corridor and asked me, without particular context, how humanity had kept the fleet dispersal secret for so long. I said it wasn't a secret, the Vorath just didn't see it as a fleet. She looked at me with the expression that, through the translation of facial equivalents, I had learned to read as intense interest. What did they see it as? She said. Colonial infrastructure, I said. Patrol routes, survey missions, things that looked individually like exactly what they were described as. They just didn't put together what those things added up to because they weren't looking for it. They had already decided what our military capacity was, so they read the evidence in a way that confirmed what they already believed. She was quiet for a moment. Confirmation error, she said. We have a name for that. So do we, I said. She looked at me again. Your species, she said slowly, is more difficult to model than we believed. We get that a lot, I said. She made a sound that the translator rendered as a short, dry acknowledgement. I think it might have been the Vorath equivalent of a laugh. I'm not certain. What I think about. I am old enough now that thinking about Cathara involves thinking about the people who are not here anymore. Admiral Yuan Chen died 4 years after the Cathara stand. Not in combat. In her sleep, on a Tuesday night in her apartment in Shanghai at the age of 73. She had retired from the fleet 2 years before that, and she had spent those 2 years doing the thing she had apparently wanted to do for decades, which was grow a very large and complicated garden. I attended the memorial. There were admirals there, and politicians, and diplomats from 4 species, including a Vorath representative who stood in the back and said nothing, but was there for the whole ceremony. And there were also, unexpectedly, a large number of ordinary people. People who had nothing obvious to do with the fleet or with Cathara, who had simply come because they wanted to. A woman standing near me, civilian 40s, I never learned her name, said to me without knowing who I was. She saved everyone, you know, all of us, every person alive. I said she gave the order. The woman looked at me. That's what I mean, she said. Marco Vasquez retired from the fleet 7 years after Cathara. I heard from him a few times over the years. He opened a small repair shop on Titan Station, not ships, actual physical machines, the kind of small mechanical work that is always needed around any large installation. He seemed happy. Priya Okonkwo became one of the most respected navigation specialists in the fleet. Last I heard, she was teaching at the academy. Dmitry Volkov is still flying. He is 44 now, which is old for a strike pilot, and I assume he will fly until either he retires or physics makes the decision for him. His 11-meter drift tolerance, Priya told me once, is something the navigation students use as a benchmark. What it means? I want to be careful here, because this part is easier to get wrong than the rest of it. There are people who tell the story of Cathara as a victory of strength, as proof that military power is the only language that matters in the universe, as evidence that humanity should have built even more ships, even earlier, should always build more. I don't think that is the right lesson. The fleet was necessary. The fleet was absolutely necessary, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. Without the fleet, the ultimatum succeeds. Without the fleet, we negotiate our way into losing 12 systems and whatever comes after 12 systems. Without the fleet, Velkorath gets to use his reception chamber. But the fleet alone is not the thing that worked. What worked was the combination, the fleet and the 41 words, the overwhelming capability and the deliberate restraint in how that capability was deployed. The ability to sit in a neutral zone for 72 hours and not fire, not one shot. Not one warning shot, not one demonstration, not one attempt to make the moment more dramatic than it already was. We showed them what we could do by not doing it. And the reason we could not do it, the reason 11,200 people on one ship alone could hold position in a neutral zone for 3 days without anyone making a mistake, without anyone losing nerve, without anyone deciding the moment called for action, was not discipline in the military sense. It was not the discipline of people following orders. It was the discipline of people who understood why. Why the fleet was there, why the position held, why the 41 words were the right words, Why the answer to will you negotiate is sometimes no, and why that answer can be the most important word you ever say. They understood what they were doing, and why, and that is what made it possible. So Valius. I met So Valius once. 6 years after Cathara, he was part of a collective scientific exchange program, one of the early ones, before the exchanges became routine. He came to Titan Station in a diplomatic capacity, accompanying a Drethani science delegation that was studying human FTL drive architecture. Someone told him I had been in the command center on the night the fleet assembled. He found me. He was a small being by the standards of his species, pale, with the characteristic Drethani ridge structure along the jaw and shoulders, and very still in the way that Drethani tend to be still. He asked me, through a translation interface, if he could ask me something. I said yes. He said, when you watched the fleet assemble on your sensors, when you saw the signatures resolving on the display, what did you feel? I thought about it. Relief, I said, for about the first minute, and then something different. What was different? Pride, I said, but not the kind of pride that's about you being better than something else, the other kind. He waited. The kind, I said, that comes from knowing the people you're with did something exactly right. He was quiet for a moment. In my report, he said, on the night I watched the signatures resolve, I used an idiom in my language. He paused. The ground has become water. I heard, I said. For your people, he said, what would be the equivalent? When the thing you expected turned out to be something entirely other. I thought about it for a moment. And then I said, we say the other shoe dropped, but that implies you knew there was another shoe. In this case, I paused. I don't think the Vorath knew we were wearing shoes at all. So Valius looked at me for a long moment. Then slowly, he made the sound that in Drethani culture is apparently the equivalent of a conceding nod. That, he said, is accurate.